All right, so this is the last lecture for chapter 24, and this one should not be quite as long as the second one. But this one's going to deal largely with the social changes that we see resulting from the Depression, and I suppose to some extent the New Deal as well. But the Depression marked the lives of everyone who lived through it. Unemployment never fell below 14% and was often considerably higher than that throughout the Depression, despite New Deal attempts to lower it. Even the employed often had to take jobs below their level of training. Psychologists described unemployment shock, where jobless people would walk the streets seeking work and then lay awake at night worrying about not being able to support themselves or their families. A lot of habits that were formed, sort of scrimping and saving habits that were formed during the 1930s, often survived into more affluent times afterwards. I remember my mom telling me about my grandmother, and whenever they would have dinner with my gran, if they had a vegetable or something, say they had corn for dinner, there could be like a tablespoon of corn left in the pot, and grandmother would box it up and save it for later, even though it's barely a spoonful of it. And all of that comes from having to do that during the Depression because every bit of food was precious then. And so a lot of those habits stuck with them. New York Senator Robert Wagner called for working women in the Depression, or called them rather, the first orphan in the storm. And in fact, female jobless rate was more than 20% for the majority of the decade. And a lot of married women who continued to work endured very harsh criticism. Critics accused them of stealing men's jobs, even though most of them worked out of economic necessity because their families needed that support. Even the Labor Secretary Frances Perkins, who was a woman no less, urged married women to leave the labor market so that men could work. Women workers faced wage discrimination profoundly, which they had always done, and in fact they still do. The late 1930s unionization drive had mixed effects on women workers. Women employed in mass production industries benefited, but the very heavily female sectors of the labor force, things like textiles or sales or clerical, resisted unionization very strongly. Despite the criticism, though, the percentage of married women in the workforce actually increased in the 1930s from just under 12% to nearly 16%. The Depression may have actually hastened the long-term movement of women to the workplace, as a lot of married women, like I say, were forced to take jobs out of necessity. The Depression also greatly affected family life. The birth rate fell considerably as a lot of married couples postponed having a family. As birth control devices became more readily available, this was much easier to achieve as well. Family survival posed major challenges. Parents were forced to patch clothing, stretch food resources, and sought public assistance when necessary. In homes with a tradition of a strong male authority, the husband's loss of a job could prove quite devastating, especially psychologically, to that husband, and the divorce rate spiked out of stress-induced animosity between the partners. The Depression spared neither old nor young. Bank failures wiped out the savings of a lot of older Americans, and so those getting ready to retire often found that they had no retirement money when they did so. High school enrollment increased as a lot of youths weren't able to find jobs, and so they stayed in school. The marriage rate declined considerably as people didn't think that they could take on the financial burdens of matrimony. Children found that vacation plans were canceled, birthdays would be with fewer presents, if any, and meal times usually were tense with rather anxious discussions around the family table. A lot of families found that they needed to rediscover traditional skills like canning. They painted their own houses, they had to repair their own cars, all in order to kind of make ends meet. For the neediest, among the minorities and sort of sharecroppers and tenant farmers and things like that, the Depression imposed added misery on what was already a fairly miserable existence. Yet, despite all these difficulties, hope still thrived in American communities. Emotional resilience, habits of mutual aid, and survival skills, all honed over the years, helped a lot of poor families cope with thoroughly miserable conditions. Looking specifically at unions, of America's over 7 million factory workers in 1930, most of them remained unorganized. But with hard times and favorable government climate, labor militancy surges in the 1930s. The Wagner Act's guarantee of workers' right to organize boosted the labor movement. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, which is an older organization, if you recall, had historically organized unions of skilled craftsmen rather than all workers in a given industry. And so in the 1930s, we see a change in that pattern. Certain members, frustrated by the slowness of the official AFL organization to organize factory workers, started up the Committee for Industrial Organization, originally within the AFO, and they preached unionization of unskilled workers especially as well. These CIO unions welcomed all workers in any particular industry, regardless of race or gender or skill level or anything. In 1936, CIO-sponsored organizations announced a strike to unionize the steel industry, and it was particularly vicious, the strike. In March of 1937, U.S. Steel recognized the union, raised wages, and introduced a 40-hour work week in response to the strike. Other organizations targeted companies like General Motors, which was also fairly vicious strike action. On February 11th, in fact, in 1937, GM signed a contract finally recognizing the United Automobile Workers. Chrysler fell in line soon after that. Unionization in the electrical and rubber industries advanced as well. Eventually, in 1938, the Committee for Industrial Organization broke officially with the AFL to become the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And in response, the AFL also began adapting to the nature of the labor force and actively recruiting more unskilled workers and women and minorities as well. Some big corporations resisted quite stringently. Henry Ford absolutely hated unions, and unionizing Ford plants was particularly difficult. In fact, it wasn't until 1941 that Ford plants officially unionized. Republic Steel Company also dug in, and that proved to be a fairly bloody confrontation. In 1941, under growing pressure, that company and others like it finally accepted a union. Another holdout was the textile industry. In 1934, the AFL affiliated United Textile Workers and launched a new drive, but the strike, which followed, ultimately failed, and the textile industry remained mostly ununionized as the 1930s came to a close. Despite the unionization surge, more than 3/4 of the non-farm labor force remained unorganized by 1940, including a lot of low-paid manual laborers, domestic workers, employees in department stores and offices, categories that included a lot of women and minorities and recent immigrants. Nevertheless, unionization of a lot of industrial workers was among one of the decade's more memorable developments. You may ask why corporations yielded to unionization after they had been so stringently against it for so many decades. And part of this was the workers' militancy, but a larger part of it was probably the changed government climate. Previous administrations, while professing a certain tolerance for labor unions in sort of the progressive era, they were never really pro-labor union. And when we get to Harding and Coolidge, they're extremely anti-labor union, in fact. But the New Deal labor laws made it clear that Washington would no longer automatically take the side of the management. And so the loss of that support encouraged a lot of businesses to go ahead and actually accept unionization. If we look specifically at sort of racial issues in the country, dealing with Hispanics, African Americans, and Native Americans, the Depression stirred a lot of activism within the African American and Hispanic communities. By 1940, there was nearly a quarter of America's 12 million African Americans living in the urbanized North. Whether rural or urban, life was particularly hard. Black tenant farmers and sharecroppers often faced eviction. Workplace racism remained a fact of life, regardless of the location. More than 100 African Americans died by lynching in the 1930s, and other miscarriages of justice continued, especially in the southern states. But rising activism also signaled that there were changes on the horizon. The NAACP battled in courts and in legislatures for voting rights and against actions like lynching and segregation. The Communist Party publicized lynchings and racial discrimination and supplied lawyers for one particular group, the Scottsboro Boys, who had been accused of rape in Scottsboro, Alabama, somewhat suspect charges of rape. The Communist Party supplied lawyers as part of their sort of recruitment effort within the black community. However, despite a few notable recruits, very few actually joined the party as a result. Very few African Americans actually joined the party as a result. Other groups also faced discrimination in California. You have restricted land ownership to Japanese Americans. Congress also limited annual immigration, from the Philippines. The more than 2 million Hispanic Americans living mostly in the Southwest also confronted a lot of difficulties. A lot of them had sort of ancestral roots in the Southwest, meaning that their families were there whenever the territory was taken over by the United States. However, a lot of them were recent arrivals from either Mexico or the Caribbean islands, such as Cuba or Puerto Rico, which is actually a U.S. territory. Puerto Rico is at this time. As the Depression deepens, Mexican-born residents endured rising hostility. You have people coming from the Dust Bowl areas migrating into California, and they compete with Hispanic farm workers for jobs. It pretty much throws off the sort of migratory work patterns. And so a large amount of these Hispanic Americans start to pour into the barrios, which are essentially sort of Hispanic neighborhoods and cities. Lacking work, about 500,000 of them returned to Mexico in the 1930s, and many did so voluntarily, but immigration officials and local authorities also forcibly repatriated others. Mexican American farm workers who remained endured appalling conditions for the most part and near starvation wages. And in response to this, you see a wave of strikes sweeping California. Organizations like the Citrus Growers Marketing Cooperative, or Sunkist, fought the unions, and sometimes with violence. But these strikes served to awaken, at least for some Americans, the plight of one of the nation's more exploited groups. For Native Americans, the 1930s also saw attention sort of refocused on them. Most of them lived in enduring poverty. They're very poorly educated and had extremely poor health care. The Dawes Act, which had been around since 1887, had dissolved the tribes as legal entities and allocated some of the tribal lands to individuals and then offered the rest for sale. The individuals also quite often sold their allotments as well. In 1923, you have a rather idealistic reformer, John Collier, who had lived among the Pueblo, still in New Mexico, and founded the American Indian Defense Association in order to reverse the Dawes approach and try to revitalize traditional tribal life. He was eventually appointed the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1933, and he worked to gather money in order to construct things like schools and hospitals and irrigation systems, and also to preserve sites of cultural importance. Pursuing his vision of sort of reinstituting traditional tribal life, he also drafted a bill that would halt tribal land sales and restore the unallocated lands to tribal control. However, some leaders among the tribes criticized the plan as an attempt to transform reservations into living museums and isolate the tribes even further from American life. In some ways, his bill reflected his own idealism uh, as a sort of well meaning outsider rather than the actual views of the Native American groups. What eventually comes out of this is the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, and it's kind of a compromise measure. It halted tribal land sales and enabled the tribes to retain title to unallocated lands, but Congress scaled back his proposals to institute tribal self-government and completely dropped proposals to renew traditional cultural practices. Of the 258 tribes that voted on the law, which it was required for it to go into effect, 181 of them favored it, while 77 did not. In fact, the largest group, the Navajo, didn't favor the law. They actually voted against it. Policy for dealing with Native Americans, however, remained fairly contentious, as it didn't really recognize the interests of the Native Americans themselves, nor did it particularly value any kind of cultural diversity. The last thing we'll look at is the cultural scene in the 1930s. The standardization of mass culture from the 20s continued into the 30s. Radio humor flourished as Americans battled hard times. Quite often, entertainment proved to be an escape more than anything else. You also see the introduction of sort of short 15-minute afternoon domestic dramas known as soap operas, mainly because soap companies were the ones that sponsored them. And these programs found a very devoted audience, mostly housewives, who would listen to them. And in fact, that's still really the target audience of a lot of soap operas, although they are no longer 15 minutes long. The movies, with their low-priced tickets, remained extremely popular. About 65% of Americans would go to the movies at least once a week during the Depression. Films in the early 30s captured the grimness of the early Depression, and the popular Marx Brothers films reflected the sort of uncertainty that characterized the Hoover years. Comedies ridiculed the authorities and satirized the established order, and were mainly escapist avenues. Movie studios like Warner Brothers made several topical films that presented the New Deal in a favorable light, essentially propaganda. Early 1930s gangster movies, actually inspired by real-life criminals like Al Capone, presented a different lifestyle, or a different style of film realism, even. Above all, though, Hollywood was that escape from Depression-era realities. When color movies arrived in the 1930s, they seemed to be an omen of better times ahead. Everything looked a lot more rosy, obviously. African Americans appeared in 1930s movies, if at all, mostly as stereotypes. So again, they are included, but not portrayed in the best light. In representing women, Hollywood also offered fairly mixed messages. While some 1930s movies' heroines found fulfillment in marriage and domesticity, other films challenged traditional stereotypes, so there was no single message being presented, much like in the previous decade as well. The 1930s ended on a sort of cautiously upbeat note. America had managed to survive the Depression, and there was no massive social revolution as a result. U.S. democracy was an enduring feature, and writers and composers and other cultural creators reflected that mood change. International development, especially in the later 30s, was starting to direct or divert American attention. And it resulted in a domestic political movement known as the Popular Front. In 1935, Russian dictator Joseph Stalin, fearing attack from Nazi Germany, called for a worldwide alliance or Popular Front against Adolf Hitler and his Italian fascist ally Benito Mussolini. The Spanish Civil War was the Popular Front's sort of high water mark. Fascist General Francisco Franco began a military revolt against Spain's legally elected government. With aid from Hitler and Mussolini, Franco won backing from Spanish monarchists, Landowners and industrialists, as well as the Catholic Church. The Spanish loyalists, meaning those who were loyal to the elected government, won support from the U.S. as well as the rather practically useless support of writers and artists and intellectuals who backed the Popular Front movement. The Popular Front collapsed ultimately in August of 1939 when Stalin and Hitler signed their non-aggression pact. As Stalin had been the one to call for the Popular Front against Hitler, the removal of his support essentially killed the movement, the international movement. Overnight enthusiasm for joining with the communists under the anti-fascism banner faded. And while it lasted, the Popular Front influenced U.S. culture, as well as alerting Americans to the growing threats coming from abroad. The New Deal's program for writers and artists and musicians, as well as its sort of more liberal turn in the second part of it, also contributed to the late 1930s cultural shift. More positive views were now replacing the rather cynical tone of the 1920s and the early 30s. In 1936, the journalist James Agee and photographer Walker Evans lived with an Alabama sharecropper family and documented it, sort of did a photo documentary. In order to show the strength and sort of decency of Depression-era Americans. So it was very positive. Jazz also gained in popularity, during the period, thanks to the sort of evolution into swing, which was a much more danceable style of jazz, originated by pianist Fletcher Henderson and popularized by bands like Count Basie and Benny Goodman. The later 1930s also saw a heightened interest in regional literature, painting, and folk art. Galleries would display folk paintings, Amish quilts, New England weather vanes, and other kind of regional artistic contributions. The surge of cultural nationalism also heightened interest in American history. Visitors flocked to historical recreations like Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia. And in Texas, Texans flocked to places like the Alamo, called the Cradle of Texas Liberty. And you also have the introduction of historical epic novels like Gone with the Wind, becoming bestsellers because of this renewed interest in American history. You also see a rather big design change or introduction in the 1930s. The design is called streamlining, and it shaped the sort of visual culture of the 1930s. It originated in the 20s, however, when industrial designers, inspired by the kind of look of airplanes, which obviously needed to be streamlined in order to work efficiently, introduced the same kind of flowing curves into the design of their commercial products. Streamlining helped corporate America rebuild its image and also present itself as a kind of shaper of a better future. You see a lot of examples of this with the World's Fair held in 1939. It was under the theme of the World of Tomorrow, and the New York World Fair represented a high point of the sort of streamlining vogue. At its Futurama exhibit, General Motors presented a vision of America in the far distant year of 1960. This included a multi-lane highway network complete with cloverleaf exits and stacked interchanges and things like that. It was a rather brilliant public relations investment as it built support for the interstate highway system, which would very soon become a reality. The Futurama exhibit also featured things like television and automatic dishwashers and portrayed 1960 America as a technological utopia created by America's corporations. The fair epitomized corporate America's version of patriotism and hopefulness, sort of stirring America as the 1930s came to a close. However, this hopefulness was tinged with a little bit of fear, as we will get to talking about in the next chapter. Danger was looming beyond the seas as World War II is brewing in Europe. And that will close us out for both this chapter and this unit. I do have one more slide, though, to talk about. Here I have some examples of streamlining. I mentioned streamlining was sort of the overall visual trend, and it was used in pretty much everything from cars, as you can see in the top right, to clocks, as you can see in the bottom right, to household appliances like irons, as you can see some examples of on the left. And so this idea of streamlining pretty much dominated the visual culture of the 1930s. If you were to look up 1930s appliances or products or cars, all of them are going to have this sort of shape to them. If you've ever seen the shape of the wing of an airplane, it has a kind of bulge in the front, and it sort of comes down to a point in the end, which is essentially the shape of that iron. It's the shape of the car, and even to some extent the shape of the clock that we can see there. And that's what they mean by mimicking the design of airplanes when it comes to streamlining. So this is actually the official end of this lecture, chapter 24, and the unit, module 2. So yeah, good luck on the exam.